Like Candace said, I'm Sam Bock. I am the Director of Publications and Interpretation at History Colorado, which means mostly nothing, but pretty much any words that go through the museum in our publications, our magazine, our podcasts, our exhibits, all of that stuff comes through my department and comes across my desk. So I just feel really lucky as a historian to be able to do this, and as a Coloradan to represent my home state. This talk is the second chapter of our book, so I'm going to go ahead and start with an absolutely shameless plug for my own book, co-authored with my friend Jason Hansen, who I also work with at History Colorado. It's a survey of Colorado's history with a beer in hand. If you like this talk, you'll probably like the book. The idea is drink it, read it, same time, same thing, right? There's a couple copies available in back, and if we sell out, which I really hope we do, they're also available from historycolorado.org and some local booksellers. So, advertorial part of the talk over. I'm here to talk about why Colorado went dry. And I think starting with this little factoid is really, really interesting, because I'm standing here with a beer in hand. Many of you are here for the beer, and probably for the beer alone, I'm sure. But oh, the whiskey, right, sorry, I forgot that. That too. But all of that was illegal, starting in 1914. And I think the question of why kind of leads us back to the beer in my hand. So we're going to go from 1914 to this very beer, and you know, it might be gone by the time we get there, but that's kind of the point, right? Okay, I'm going to start with a wordy slide, and I promise this is the only one, but it's important. Americans were drinking about 36 million gallons of beer in 1850, before Colorado was even a state. By 1890, that figure increased to 855 million gallons. So to put it another way, in those 40 years, America's population almost tripled, while beer's consumption rate grew more than 40 times. Yeah, right? It's a party. We go from this is the very first brewery in Colorado. It's the Rocky Mountain Brewery, founded in Denver in 1859 by two German immigrants to the United States. To this, the massive, industrial-scale, coal-powered, rail-fueled brewery in Golden, known as Coors, just 30 years later, right? So this is part of this huge expansion of drinking rates, and particularly of beer drinking rates, that happened in the middle of the 19th century, the 1800s. And what's going on at this time? A huge influx of particularly German, but mostly European immigrants, especially to Colorado, but all around the country. And they brought with them their drinking habits, their drinking traditions, and their brewing traditions. Interestingly, Colorado's founding, and its earliest days in the gold rush in the late 1850s, coincided with this inrush of migration, but also, critically, the invention of lager beer. How many people here are drinking one of those Mexican cervezas? That is the result of German immigration to Mexico. Lager is very different from ale. So I'm probably telling you something you don't know, or you already know, but I'm going to do it anyway because I've got the microphone. Lager tends to be crisper, lighter, and easier to drink than ale. It tends to be rested. That's what lagering is in German. It's resting in barrels for longer, and that allows the proteins in the beer to kind of filter out, fall to the bottom. And it produces what we know as this really drinkable, really, in modern parlance, the sessionable lager. This beer that is light in flavor, that's refreshing, it's easy to drink, and critically was very different from the English-based ale drinking traditions that came from Britain, and that really were the foundation of American beer drinking habits all the way until this massive influx of German migrants in the middle of the 19th century. All of this beer around the country, but particularly here in Colorado, is being consumed in saloons. I think, the term saloon it's from the French salon, and it was applied to drinking establishments on the East Coast where they were trying to create an air of refinement, right? But as things went west, I think that refinement may have kind of fallen out. It's a little bit harder to discern when it comes to these tent saloons, which, in most places in Colorado, this happens to be in Creed. Most places in Colorado, this is what you get. The very first building in town was probably something like this. It was a saloon. It was probably just a tent put up over a couple of barrels, and maybe, if you're really lucky, a bar and a place to sit, like hewn from logs. But as time went on, and more towns were established, and they started to really get a foothold, if the gold strike panned out or their economy took off, you started to get more complicated saloons, more welcoming places that maybe even had walls or, say, a roof. Like a lot of people in Colorado history, including our airport architects, they realized you could get pretty far on a stretch of canvas. So these saloons popped up all over the state. And of course, they're concentrated in Denver, which is the biggest population center, and consequently is the place with the most saloons. It was possible in the 1870s, as Colorado was becoming a state, to essentially stumble from one side of Denver to the other without having to leave a saloon. The city had more saloons per capita than just about any other city in the nation, including in more populous states like Iowa, Nebraska, even Illinois and Indiana. And drinking rates in Denver were exactly what you would expect with that kind of number of saloons. And that actually is a pattern that holds true across the state throughout the 1800s. In places like Creed, in places like Steamboat Springs, in places like Leadville, saloons were the one-stop shop. They were essentially where you go to get your mail and have a social life. But as, hang on, excuse me, I went too fast. As the state started to develop, you start to get more civic institutions. Places start to build schools. They start to build post offices and dedicated hotels and all the services that we associate with the modern American life. And drinking rates, as we said before, were just completely out of control. And I think I say that fairly, right? As a historian, that is my assessment. It's out of control. And the history bears this out, because prohibition movements start in Colorado almost right away. It took until 1908 for Routt County to have a vote on prohibition, which failed. But the town of Steamboat went dry. And I was kind of digging through the archives a little bit. I'm not here to tell you your own history, but I discovered that the saloon owners of Steamboat moved their saloons, physically picked them up and moved them, I think, across the river to Brooklyn?
Yeah.
Brooklyn? Yeah. So I didn't know there was a place called Brooklyn, Colorado. I'm learning things. That's why I do this. But, I mean, that just goes to show how strong the anti-drinking sentiment was, but also how divided Colorado was over the subject of drinking. And it turns out that whether you were for a dry Colorado or you were for a wet Colorado depended a lot on your socioeconomic status and on your religion. And these were the flashpoints, the political and social flashpoints of the day. We tend to think of these anti-alcohol crusaders as kind of this person, right? This is Carrie Nation. She is known for going into saloons across the United States and busting up beer kegs with this hatchet. She called them her hatchetations, right? And so we get this vision of kind of this dour, old religious lady who frowns on all the fun that all these people are having. But as the fun sucker in chief at History Colorado, I'm here to make that a little more complicated. She was motivated in part by her first marriage to a drunkard. And that came along with a lot of the negative social and sort of family effects of alcohol consumption that we know today, right? These are not mysterious things. Violence against the family, poverty due to overconsumption of alcohol, these are common problems that we understand today and that were prolific in the late 19th and early 20th century across the nation, and especially here in Colorado, where a lot of those social services just were starting to get off the ground. Carrie Nation herself was actually arrested twice in the same day in Colorado, once in Trinidad and once in Denver, for busting up saloons. And she found comradeship and lifelong friendship with a woman named Adriana Hungerford, who was the head of Colorado's Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was really strong here in the early 20th century. So Colorado goes dry in 1916, but this is after 20, 30 years of dedicated campaigning from groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, other temperance groups around the state. And it's really this patchwork of prohibition that starts kind of as a reaction to overdrinking in Denver. It's kind of seen as like the Sodom and Gomorrah of the state, even though, Colorado wasn't exactly a shining beacon of morality across the board in the early 20th century. But counties like Broward County had these votes. Basically every county in Colorado had these votes. City of Boulder was dry. City of Fort Collins was dry. Some of the most hop-happy, beer-loving places in the state were dry communities, and they were founded that way specifically as a reaction to this social problem. And just to give an illustration of how bad this problem was, it showed up in newspapers, and it's really easy to find. I did one quick search in the Colorado Historic Newspaper database and came up with 3 different alarming stories of violence related to alcohol consumption. I'll share 2. One was a story of a man in Leadville who was arrested for threatening his wife and hungry children with an axe because, and this is quoted in the newspaper, because his wife threatened to take his hat. Doesn't seem like a great reason to threaten your wife, but he's drunk. Second one is even more gruesome. A laborer in Fort Collins murdered his wife in, quote, a state of beastly intoxication, was in the newspaper, and then was subsequently dragged out of the jail and lynched by an angry mob for this. So we like to think, at least I often, before I started doing this research, thought of Prohibition as, glitzy, jazz age flappers and, all of the kind of wink nod, fun time drinking that was done underground and stuff. But it was really a reaction to an extremely pernicious set of social issues that people didn't really know how to address, that society was failing to figure out how to address with any other way than total prohibition. And so I think for me, that helps me understand that this wasn't just some whimsical, progressive flash in the pan attempt to regulate good times, but it was really a reaction to an incredibly damaging moment, an incredibly damaging thing for American families that they talked about in a lot of the same way as we talk about the opioid epidemic today. And I think seeing that parallel makes me really kind of empathize with this movement, and it makes me understand why this group of moralizing progressives took hold of the Constitution, and for the first time in American history, with the passage of the Prohibition Amendment, actually actively prohibited citizens of the United States from doing something. It took away a freedom from the people. Every other constitutional amendment takes away powers of the government. This one, or defines, freedoms of Americans, essentially. This one took away those freedoms. So, what happened next? The rest of the country goes dry. I didn't even explain this photo. I'm sorry, I'm gonna go back. So this is one of my favorite photos from the History of Colorado collection. This is in Uray. This is dumping alcohol. It's a whole party of dumping alcohol into the gutter, and specifically dumping beer. You see this keg, number 44, is from the Schneider Brewing Company in Trinidad. One of the 5 breweries that survived Prohibition in Colorado. We'll come back to that in a second. Okay, so country goes dry January 17th, 1920, as a result of the Volstead Act, 18th Amendment. And a lot of really interesting things happen, right? Anytime you get these big dramatic shifts in American history, you tend to see some really, really revealing stuff. So for me, I'm a home brewer. I think this is a natural place to start. This is something we figured out as we were doing research for our book. When Americans can't buy beer legally, they tend to figure out how to make it themselves. This goes all the way back to colonial days. We see recipes for cornstalk beer coming out of colonial New England. In fact, the very first beer brewed in the American West was made on the Lewis and Clark expedition, when bread made from camas root got soaked in traversing the Columbia River, and they said, well, we're not just going to throw this away, and they made beer out of it. It couldn't have been very good, and camas root is like basically poisonous, and these guys, this is totally going way off the rails here, so I'll get back to it in a second. But the journals of Lewis and Clark are filled with stories about the stomach maladies that came from eating camas root bread that the native peoples along the way gave them. They called it the big wind. Just to give you a sense of it. So this trend of making beer yourself comes all the way through American history. Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha Jefferson, was a brewer herself. She was noted for her honey wheat ale. Thomas Jefferson's enslaved brewmaster made all kinds of beer, and we have a recipe from him from 1787. It's a porter known as a small beer. It's essentially just an 18th century term for a weak beer. It's something that's under about 5%. And then coming all the way up through Prohibition, Americans aren't really willing to give up beer, so you get almost instantly breweries, especially these mega breweries like Budweiser and Coors, respond by making near beer, which is alcohol-free beer, or producing this hop-flavored barley malt syrup, which I just find hilarious because it was marketed, and Pabst made it, a bunch of other companies made it, and it was marketed as a baking beer. And so surely there was some Prohibition enforcement agent thinking, okay, what are you doing with this hop-flavored malt syrup? Surely it can't be good for muffins or cookies or anything like that, right? So, but they can't prosecute because, it's not illegal to have hop-flavored syrup. And actually in Colorado before 1920, it's not illegal to make your own beer. It's not illegal to own beer, it's just illegal to sell it. Which leads me to another one of my very favorite stories, and this one's a little close to home up here. A man in the Mount Harris coal camp was arrested in, I think it was 1918, for selling beer. And even though he said, no, I'm not selling it, I'm just drinking everything, myself, the newspaper reported that even given his, quote, abnormal capacity, there's no way he was drinking all this beer and he surely was selling to others.
Keg a day.
Yeah, at least a keg a day. This was a full-scale industrial production. There's no chance. So as Prohibition went on, alcohol became even more tightly regulated, essentially as an industrial solvent for the most of the time. That was usually the only use, or the only legal use for alcohol. There were carve-out exemptions for religious practice, so it was possible to get wine and other spirits if you were a rabbi or a priest or something like that. But a lot of the time that was abused, and the feds started cracking down on that pretty heavily. The other thing they did was essentially poison alcohol by allowing it to be tainted with ethyl alcohol, grain alcohol, that's what makes you go blind. You can't drink that. That's the industrial solvent. And the feds knew that people might be drinking this, and they just said, well, it's illegal, and so if you're drinking it, you shouldn't be, and you're gonna go blind, and we don't really care to save you. This was the attitude towards drinking at the time. It was really seen, I would say in the same way, I hate to keep coming back to this comparison, but the same way that we see these really pernicious drugs in our society today. It was really frowned on, it was regulated, and there wasn't a lot of sympathy if you happened to be hooked on the early 20th century equivalent of fentanyl. The other unintended consequence of Prohibition was that it made crime skyrocket all across the nation, and even here in Colorado. And I'm not just talking about take something that people love and you make it illegal, and if they keep doing it, then it's a crime. I'm talking about the organized transport, making of, and distribution of either imported alcohol or moonshine. And in Colorado, what that meant was a huge shot in the arm for the nascent mob. You see here on the screen, maybe two really famous Denver mobsters, Pete Carlino and Joe Roma. And then, of course, we have probably the most famous of them all, Clyde Smaldone. If you've ever been to the restaurant in North Denver, which is, oh my gosh, it's totally escaping me. So I told him a great part. Yeah. Again, sorry. What was it? Guy Thomas, thank you. Oh my gosh. Appreciate it. Say you did. Yeah, Guy Thomas, the Italian restaurant owned by the Small family, was absolutely a bootlegging hub in the early 20th century. So essentially, the Italian mob was kind of a collection of ragtag groups of maybe criminals, maybe just kind of teenagers in southern Colorado, Trinidad and Pueblo. And they would kind of invoke the Black Hand to scare other Italian immigrants, but there wasn't an organized mob, right, with like a head and the families that we think of, from The Godfather and that kind of thing, until Prohibition. Prohibition was what really gave them the financial wherewithal and the organizing reason to become what we think of as organized crime. So initially, these groups started coming together under just extreme conditions of ridiculous violence. I'm talking about sawed-off shotguns on the streets of Pueblo, out of cars, just the carnage. If you think about, just walking down the street, someone's murdered with a sawed-off shotgun outside of a car, left in the street in Pueblo as a message. I mean, this is the kind of violence we're talking about with these groups. After a particularly violent encounter between some bootleggers and law enforcement agents in Colorado, the state decided that they needed a more effective statewide police unit. And this is where we get the State Patrol. There was no statewide law enforcement agency in the 1920s. And bootleggers, particularly ones connected to the mob, knew exactly where the county line was. And if they were getting chased by the sheriff, they just said, oh, well, boop, pop across this county line, I'm out of your jurisdiction, you can't arrest me, I'm gonna keep driving however I get to Denver. So the state organizes the Colorado Rangers, mostly drawn from returned World War I veterans. And in fact, they are wearing their World War I uniforms here, just with the insignia removed, and they're given a badge. And I don't know if you can make it out, but these guys are absolutely heavily armed with World War I era machine guns. This is a motorcycle. I want this thing. This is a motorcycle with a sidecar mounted with a .30 caliber Browning machine gun. Water-cooled Browning machine gun. And the rest of them had, you can see they have early versions of Browning automatic rifles. So this is not just your 6-shooter, Prohibition, flapper, speakeasy, busting cops. These are heavily armed, heavily trained soldiers, essentially, patrolling Colorado. And this guy on the right, or excuse me, well, he's on my right now, but on the left here, who's driving the motorcycle, holding the rifle, his name is Eddie Bell, and he was the first Colorado Ranger killed in the line of duty. He was attacked and beaten to death by bootleggers on the way to Denver on the road between essentially what is now Castle Rock. And so this murder was really a catalyst for making sure that that county sheriff's office and municipal police had essentially an armory. This is when we think of modern SWAT units, essentially this is where this comes from. It's from Prohibition. So of course, they're not bootlegging beer for the most part. They would import beer from Mexico. This is the age of Corona and Dos Equis, these breweries that we think of today as, kind of Mexican fluff for drinking on the beach. Well, that was serious beer at the time because, what you could get was homebrew or that. And a lot of them opened breweries right along the Mexican border, in parts of Mexico that are like kind of Texas. So that's the beer that's coming into Colorado, but mostly what they're bootlegging is heavier stuff, it's spirits, because it's easier to transport, right? I mean, just one bottle of whiskey is the same potency as like 10 beers, right? Or I don't know, a lot of beers. And so it's just more compact, it just makes more sense. And beer goes into this massive decline in popularity following the introduction of Prohibition. The other unintended consequence, and the one that I think is the most interesting, is that Prohibition, in Colorado especially, was the catalyst for the rise of the KKK. Colorado's KKK had the second highest membership per capita in the country after Indiana in the 1920s. And their platform, this is kind of the second coming of the KKK. The first is organized after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, as a vigilante terror organization to ensure that Black Americans didn't have access to the rights they had just won. This second coming of the Klan begins in the early 20th century as a response to increased immigration, particularly from Catholic countries in Central and Northern Europe. Their nativist, xenophobic messaging really hit home in Colorado for two reasons. The first was Colorado being really at the peak of its coal mining boom was attracting just a flood of immigrants, particularly from Italy and Ireland, two very Catholic countries, increasing suspicion of the Pope. And then the second reason was that what I mentioned before, that huge increase in crime. And so the KKK was really effective at saying, this increase in crime is coming from immigrants from these Catholic countries who don't respect American traditions. They're not like us. They don't care about our laws, and they're flouting prohibition. They're just drinking all the time in plain sight. And so we, the KKK, are going to do what the cops can't. We are going to enforce our laws. We are going to make America for Americans. We're going to make, well, I was going to say make America great again, but well, sorry. I figured I was a good comedy. But I think that's flippant and probably a little bit anachronistic, but it's not entirely anachronistic because the same rhetoric that we're seeing today around immigration, around suspicion and fear and Americanism, it's not new. This goes all the way back to the 20s and even beyond. So this fear was really what propelled the KKK to prominence. And there were Klaverns all over the state. Klavern is the term for the local Klan organization. There was one here in Steamboat Springs. There was one, very strong one in Pueblo, very strong one in Boulder, my hometown, I'm sorry to say. Interestingly, the one in Colorado Springs could never take off. Which I find interesting because, today the politics of that county, I think would really lead us to think, okay, that would be a stronghold. Turns out it was too white, it was too wealthy, it was too Protestant for this message of fear to really take hold. And so that municipality just really was not fertile ground. And I think, to me, that's just evidence of what I was saying before, that this is really based around fear of the other. And the more contact that this kind of upper class Anglo-Protestant society had with with immigrants and with people who didn't speak the language or look like them, the more likely it was that they were going to fall prey to the Ku Klux Klan. Pardon me for just a second. It's a little toasty up here. So in 1924, when Denver Mayor Benjamin Stapleton beat his recall, which was essentially a referendum on his Klan membership, the KKK held a cross burning on top of South Table Mountain, about, spitting distance from the Coors Brewing Company. There's no evidence the Coors family was there or ever involved with the Ku Klux Klan, I will note that. But it was right around the corner on land that was associated with the Coors family. And Benjamin Stapleton said to this rally, I promise that if I am reelected with the Klan's support, I will give the Klan the administration that they want. Those were his words. And what that meant was going all in on the Klan. When he was first elected, he was kind of hesitant to really give his entire administration over to the KKK. But as crime continued to increase and prohibition scofflaws were just in everybody's face, and the violence associated with prohibition increased in Denver, Stapleton leaned more heavily on the KKK and installed a Klan member as chief of police, which he had been hesitant to do after his recall. The guy's name was William Candlish. His nickname in the Denver Post was Coca-Cola Candlish with K's. A lot of that going around. And really it turned the Denver Police Department into an arm of the Klan. which was extremely far-reaching. So I promised I wouldn't do this too much more text, but this is Clarence Morley. He is a pretty unknown figure in Colorado history, but he was state's governor in the 1920s, and this is his name and his address in the KKK Denver Clavern Register, in the ledger books that we have in our collection at History Colorado, which will be on display in a new exhibit coming up about American history. Morley, he was pretty ineffective by the time he came into office. The odiousness and the obvious anti-Americanism of the KKK was starting to erode the Klan's influence in Colorado. But he pressured institutions like the University of Colorado, like the State Historical Society, to root out anyone who wasn't on board with his agenda and the Klan's mission in the 1920s. So a lot of stuff happens because of Prohibition in the state. And it's a 13-year period, it's 18 years here in Colorado, or 17 years in Colorado of illegality. But by 1933, the nation had been through, the nation and then Colorado had been through the Dust Bowl. They were in the midst of the Great Depression. It was, time for a beer, I think, is the way to say it. A lot of people could really use a drink. And interestingly, women lead the way back, and they lead the way back with beer. Women who had been receiving an unequal share of the negative burdens of alcohol consumption in American society saw beer and drinking as part of a new liberation movement. Before Prohibition, co-ed drinking was just not done, not in any kind of a concentrated way. If you were drinking in mixed company, it was likely that you were doing so outside in a very kind of open environment that wasn't prone to violence or getting out of hand. It was usually with a family. And women really saw this right as kind of essential, as suffrage and new liberties were coming online in the 1930s. And so beer becomes a symbol of freedom for many women around the country. And they start these campaigns. I'm no camel. I can't go without beer. I want to drink. So women really, the catalyst for Prohibition were also the ones to lead the way back. So thank you all. Cheers. The 18th Amendment is repealed in 1933. And what I mean by beer leads the way back is that a special session of Congress created 3-2 beer to expedite the return of drinking to this country. Beer was seen as a less pernicious, as a healthier, as a less destructive means of getting a buzz. And I think that's something that kind of we retain in some way today. Maybe not with like the Imperial Pumpkin Ales and the giant 12%, winter beers that we have now, but 3-2 beer, road soda, right? It's pretty easy to drink, it's pretty non-threatening, and this is the advertising angle that American brewers grab onto and really run with in the decades following Prohibition. It's not that the anti-alcohol contingent goes away, and in fact, I was looking today through some records in the Steamboat pilot, and there were subsequent to, actually even into the 1950s, there were dry referendums on the ballot in Route County. So it's not as if this, it's like, oh, we tried Prohibition, it didn't work, and it just went away. It's still a question, and I think today it's a little bit less settled than it was maybe 5-10 years ago when I started working on this book. I started working on this in 2012 at the height of the craft beer renaissance in Colorado. And here we are 13 years later, and a whole new generation of drinkers has come around, and they're starting to say, well, maybe alcohol isn't that great for society, and maybe it's really not that great for your body. So it's this pendulum that swings back and forth in American history. But in the 1930s, 1940s, the upshot was, beer comes back, but it comes back different, critically different, in a way that I think gets us back to this can of craft beer going. So that's where we're going. all you get coming out of Prohibition, the breweries that were ready to go on day one, there were 5 of them in the state, 4 of them in the state, was Schneider in Trinidad, Walter in Pueblo, Tivoli in Denver, and Coors in Golden, right? So 4 breweries, they're all German breweries, they all really only have a tradition of making lager beer. And after 13 years of illegality, you have an entire generation, much like the current one, of drinkers who had no experience of anything other than this light lager. So returning World War II vets, you know, your suburban dad in the 1950s, to them, beer was one thing. It was this light, pale, yellow American lager that really actually didn't resemble pre-Prohibition lager in any way other than it was easier to drink. Brewers in the 1950s figured out that the palate Americans had for beer just had eroded. There was no taste for big hoppy beers. There was no taste for malty ales. There was really only one kind of beer, and it was consumed sort of by default. If you were a beer drinker, that's what you had. And so this sets the stage, right, for the homebrew movement, for the craft brew movement, coming full circle back to my adage, when Americans can't buy beer, or at least don't have access to beer that they want to buy, they tend to figure out how to brew it themselves. And that's what happened in Colorado particularly, but other sort of hubs of this progressive New Western ideology that was coming out of places like Berkeley and Boulder and Portland and Seattle, where returning vets from different wars, from just deployments abroad, had the opportunity to taste what other countries were brewing. Belgian beers became big. New Belgium is founded. You've got, you know, other kinds of lagers coming out of Germany. You've got Bocks and Dunkels and all kinds of different stuff. And that's what was the catalyst for this craft beer movement. Those home brewers figured out that they could go pro, starting in the 80s with the help of the Great American Beer Festival and Coors, and they just blew up and they expanded into this kaleidoscope of different breweries and brewers that we have around the state today. So I'm going to leave on this quote, which I think sums up what I'm trying to say really well. Inevitably, there's always someone smarter and better at words than me. This is Daniel Ockren in his excellent book, Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition. He says, Americans had several decades mourning, decades during which a popular movement like none the nation had ever seen, a mighty alliance of moralists and progressives, suffragists and xenophobes, had legally seized the Constitution, bending into a new purpose. That, I think, along with the beer in my hand, is the legacy of Prohibition. It is the first time in American history where Americans say we want fewer rights. And it turns out that for a while it worked, but the way it worked made it odious. It turned out that it was just a catalyst and a vehicle for people with privilege to flout the law. It was massively expensive for the United States government to enforce this new law. And it's really, really hard to enforce what goes on in people's homes. And all those things together, I think, taught us some lessons as a country that, you know, may or may not be enduring. It might be too early to say. But for me, it really did make Colorado the best place in the world to buy beer, because without this, you don't get the 400 some odd beers or breweries in the country. And I know people say Munich, and I know there's this place called Belgium, but really, let's be real. You can get any beer you want in the state, and it can stand next to any of those places in the world. So I'm proud to be a Coloradan. That's my spiel. Thank you so much for having me here. Very happy.
Why did it take so long for Colorado to be able to get rid of the 3-2 beer in the grocery stores?
Oh man. Okay, so the question is, why did it take so long for 3-2 beer to leave grocery stores, essentially? It was market forces, effectively, and laws. So, you know, Prohibition leaves behind this incredibly convoluted, and the reason I don't talk about it is it's a very boring history of just really tangled laws. So for the longest time, 3-2 beer was sold in grocery stores because that was the limit for what you could sell in a grocery store. And until, I mean, maybe what, like 2 or 3, 4 years ago? I mean, until really recently, couldn't sell beer in local grocery stores. And I think that law actually is another part of why Colorado is such a great place to drink beer, because when you have a tiny local liquor store, it's really easy for a small brewer to just walk in with a couple cases and say, hey, can you put this on the shelf? And the liquor store says, yeah, sure, I don't need to buy like 25 cases of this stuff just to see if it sells. That's what happens in big, giant grocery store
But,
chains.
we're not in the Bible Belt or something, so they just,
Close to it.
Well,
The thing it was you could buy it when you were 18 years old.
and back then you could buy it when you're 18 years old. That's another really good point.
Yes.
Born in Lincoln, trying to go out to a lot.
Yeah, I mean, another thing, you could just drink it all day, so, yeah.
Drive to Wyoming, and it was 19.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh, that I didn't know.
back in the late 70s.
It was 19 in Wyoming? Okay.
Yeah. You go up there.
For full strength beer?
Yeah, for full strength beer.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I should talk to my mom about that.
19 in Nebraska.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a little road trip. Yeah.
I was at CSU in Collins in the early 60s, and there the town was only 3-2 beer. And you had to go outside of town, and some of the bars around, it's just very close, but you could get regular beer or whiskey. And then we, as college students, we could drink the 3-2 beer. But what was the reason for stuff like that? Was that just a local aberration, or?
Yeah, so the question is essentially, why are certain locales basically dry or only have a 3-2 beer law well into the 20th century? And essentially it's just that same local instinct, right? It's the same local instinct that caused, Route County to put dry initiatives on the ballot every year for like the first 20 years of its existence. It's local people. It's also Colorado's really open sort of municipal control laws. Municipalities and counties in this state have a lot of control over what happens within their borders, and it's pretty easy to get initiatives on the ballot in these local counties. So, I think it was a lot of the Prohibition generation, and I think as that generation started to fade out, people's attitudes towards alcohol were much more welcoming. And yeah, so I think like Boulder was dry again on and off for a couple decades, so was Fort Collins, and now they're like the best place in the state to get a beer. Odell, like one of the biggest, best breweries in the state. Fort Collins has, there's no shortage, right, in Belgium. So yeah, I saw you go first.
When a Ku Klux Klan member became the governor, was the primary purpose to help with the prohibition reinforcement or to prevent the civil rights from being enforced?
Yeah, so the question is kind of why did the Klan want to take over these political offices?
What was their primary purpose?
What was their primary purpose? And yeah,
Americanize America.
yeah. So their justification was law and order. I mean, they kind of wrapped themselves in this cloak, or this hood, maybe, if you will, of patriotic, enforcement of American values, right? But underneath, it was taking advantage of this climate of fear and suspicion of the other, of immigrants to the United States. And it's hard for me as a historian to say, yeah, their only goal was to take away rights and make life miserable for immigrants and non-Protestant people. But that was the effect. And, I think I would say it was a reign of terror for a lot of Jewish, Catholic, Black, Hispano people in Colorado in the 1920s. And a lot of it just came down to the sheer size of the Klan. And they were really open about this. I mean, they advertised for Klan. They put Klan membership application cards in the Denver Post. Like, this is not underground, right? This is something that was right out in your face. So, I think the purpose was America for Americans. And, again, it's that same rhetoric we see over and over again in United States history. The current, anti-immigrant rhetoric is nothing new. In fact, they're recycling the same language they used in the 20s. Yeah.
So, I guess I don't understand the implications of the repeal of Prohibition. So, Colorado went dry before Prohibition. Did the repeal of Prohibition invalidate all prior laws, or did Colorado just enact a repeal of that?
Oh, that's a great question. So essentially, the repeal of the 18th Amendment ended prohibition at the federal level. And essentially what it did was reset everything to zero across the board for states. And so states had to rebuild their liquor laws from scratch, essentially, starting in 1920. And so that there was the possibility that Colorado could have said, we're still going to be dry. That's not what people wanted. So it was really that the pro-alcohol movement was so strong across the country that no state, no elected representative was going to say, actually, I think we should still be dry. They would have lost. That was not a popular platform. And so that's why every single state pretty much had to create its own liquor license, its own laws, all from scratch. And I think what's really interesting about this is I didn't go into super detail about this, but I had like 3/4 of a beer and, you're all captive audience. So Colorado's, for example, for a long time in Colorado, you couldn't fill a growler with beer that was brewed at another location. You couldn't sell beer in your restaurant that was brewed on premises because all of these laws were created after Prohibition to essentially keep organized crime from regaining a stranglehold on the liquor trade. And those things were very gradually repealed over time as different business owners and different brewers, segments of the brewing market started taking off. So for example, you couldn't open a brew pub in Colorado until the mid-'80s. There's a handful of really big brewers by that point. Boulder Beer, you're starting to see other early breweries take off, the Colorado Hounds Brew Company. But it wasn't until legislative action that you could open a brew pub where you made beer and you made food at the same place. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's still illegal to sell beer that's not made on the premises. So for example, I go to the Southern Sun in Denver all the time. I don't know if everyone's familiar, but there's like 3 or 4 of these brew pubs. They're called the Mountain Sun, Southern Sun, all this, Boulder, and Denver. And they brew at all these locations. But if the beer that I want at the Southern Sun in Boulder was brewed at the Vine Street pub in Denver, they can't sell me that beer even though it's just there on the tap. They can't sell it to go. They can't fill a growler with it. And again, it's because of this really convoluted patchwork of liquor laws that came about after Prohibition, aimed at keeping the mob from taking it over again. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Did that have anything to do with the premise of, in Colorado for years, you've got the liquor store, right? And now, you can buy future beer in the grocery store. Now you can buy wine in the grocery store. So how did that whole process develop? Whereas the liquor store and whoever had the liquor license could sell the alcohol.
I'm really glad I'm in a great company of nerds here. This is awesome. So yeah, you're essentially right. And the liquor store in Colorado was kind of a compromise. If you think about Utah and I think Vermont, these are states that have a really strong state-run liquor store model. And that was one model that a lot of states followed following Prohibition. So Utah, for example, you can't buy cold beer. And you can only buy beer, I think it's still true, you can only buy beer at a state-run liquor store, and they all close at 6 o'clock. It's hard to drink there. I think that makes sense given the demographics in those particular states. Colorado was kind of a compromise. It was a middle ground where we said, we're not gonna be like California where you can buy wine and beer just in the grocery store. It's convenience. The state has no business selling or telling these merchants that they can't do what they want to do. Colorado, I think mainly because of its experience with the violence of organized crime, took that middle road. And they said you can buy the weakest possible beer at 18 in the grocery store. Because frankly, it's just really hard to get drunk on 3-2 beer. You have to really want to do it. And you have to buy a lot. So that kind of puts it out of reach for most people. And so they attempted to sort of control it by putting it into specifically licensed liquor stores. And again, I think that's part of the reason we have so many craft breweries that package and sell beer in this state is because, again, it's just easier to sell if you're a small producer to a small liquor store where they don't have to buy a ton of it. When that changed, I think that combined with the ongoing supply chain problems from COVID and changing drinking habits, like these things all happened at the same time in the last 5 years. And what it's done is taken a lot of these sort of mid-sized brewing companies in Colorado, Denver Beer, Fort Collins Brewing Company, Ska, I mean, you name a mid-sized brewing company that puts its beer in cans, and they are in trouble, essentially, because they're facing competition from all kinds of outside forces, even as there's just a smaller market for their product. And so this wave of consolidations where we see like Oscar Blues and Denver Beer and these mid-sized breweries combining into one conglomerate, that is just, I think, the natural contraction of the industry and sort of changing drinking habits. But interesting, I think this is interesting. It's exactly what happened in the 1890s. Following the silver crash of 1893, there is a huge wave of British investment in Colorado breweries, and they come through and they buy up. There's like 43 Colorado breweries. That's like the peak pre-prohibition, and they buy up 3/4 of those breweries and either close them or consolidate them or in some way kind of bring them all under one roof. And it's exactly the same thing that's happening now with these mid-sized breweries. The ones that are thriving are the locals that don't can, that don't distribute that much. They really only are this hub of community drinking in places like Steamboat, and particularly in outdoor recreation hubs in wealthier communities around the state. Yeah?
So given the consolidation that you're seeing and just following what you just talked about, we've seen a lot of changes in the brewing business. Who are your top 5 brewers in the city of Denver?
In terms of volume?
Just like who you're going to Denver. Who
Yeah.
do you need to check out? They've all changed.
They all changed so much. It's super true. So, oh man, that is a hard question to answer. It's so personal.
Can I
Yeah.
add that
So personal, huh?
If you also had like historically, would you say is the most, if you know the most interesting of their, how they came up, I mean, of course, how good they are, how well they do what they do, but also like the history maybe of how they came up, like who would be the most interesting to look into?
Okay, I really wish I gave this talk like 3 weeks ago because the Tivoli Brewing Company just closed. And I mean, yeah, and it's shocking to me. First of all, because they are connected to the University of Colorado Denver and MSU. They had a brewing program through that brewery, and so they had massive support.
And as a former MSU professor, I graded a lot of papers there.
Yeah, totally. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I spilled coffee on it, right? So that one just closed, but that one, it's kind of a convoluted line, but it's a direct descendant of the Rocky Mountain Brewing Company, the very first brewery in Colorado. So that one has the heritage. That's the oldest one, kind of. Like the brewmaster bought it, and then it kind of goes through everything. So, I mean, I would have said that one. Okay, Wine Coop. I know it's connected to our senator, and it's like kind of old and stuffy at this point. If you're like really in the Denver beer scene, but they've got a really good brewmaster, and it's a really fun historic building. So, highly recommend that one. There's a newer brewing company that specializes only in German lagers, right? This is all about full circle, right? We're always doing full circle. But their brewmaster is internationally recognized as one of the best lager brewers in the entire country. In fact, she literally wrote the book on brewing lager beer in the United States. And Ashley something is her name. She's just incredible. Their beer is great. They're in Rhino. So that's 2 that are really good.
Is that Prost or?
Bierstadt.
Oh, Bierstadt.
Bierstadt.
Oh, Bierstadt,
Yeah. What is her name? Ashley something. Anyway, her book is fascinating. And then, the reason this is really hard to answer is that Denver is really about your local. So like I'm gonna say Green Mountain Brewing Company, which is a teeny tiny brewing company in Lakewood that's stumbling distance from my house. But I think it's the best because it's mine. And that, I think, is where the industry is going more and more, particularly in Denver. But you see this across the country. And it's not like it used to be, where it was like, New Belgium, biggest brewery in the state, independently owned, makes an incredible kaleidoscope of ridiculously good beers. Well, they're owned by Keurig now, and they only make Voodoo Ranger, as far as I know. Like, it's really small. And so this balkanization of breweries, it's more like restaurants. Like, you've got your local restaurant, and you go there on your date night, or you just go there because you don't have any food in the house. And it's kind of like that for breweries now, I think. So, I think those are two not to miss. Denver beer is really, really good. Who's making a really good beer? Okay. I almost forgot. Racist Brewing Company. They are like adjacent to Mile High Stadium. And they're brewmasters from Puerto Rico, and they make some really interesting sort of Caribbean, Central American, Mexican style beers that blow me away every time. It's probably the most interesting beer in the city. So, yeah.
Different kind of question. How did Coors become so popular that Easterners who come to Colorado would bring back the cases of Coors?
It was the mystique. It was all a mystique. So I had to ask my mom about this. So my mom grew up in Laramie. And, for me, coming of age in the world of craft beer, Coors was the enemy, right? Like, this is like thin, watery rice beer in a carbonated can. It's horrible, right? I have a newfound respect for Coors. But what really changed my tune was that my mom had to explain to me that, like, Coors is to craft as craft was to Coors back then. Like, Coors was the craft beer. It was rare, it was unavailable, it had a reputation for really high quality. Whether or not that was deserved is kind of an individual choice and an individual opinion. But back then, so for example, Bill Coors was an engineer by training, took over the brewery after World War II, invented the aluminum beverage can that we're all drinking out of right now. But importantly, he refused to pasteurize their beer. And the reason that matters is beer is a living beverage, and if you heat it up, it kills tons of flavor. And so they invested like the modern equivalent of billions of dollars in this cold filtering system that made the beer sterile, but also made it perishable. And so they also had to create their whole own distribution company with refrigerated trucks, and they had to have a contract with every distributor and every liquor store that said, you will keep this cold. And they did spot checks all around the country. And so that was one of the reasons that they kept it to, I think it was 11 states west of the Mississippi until 1977. So when you get like Smokey and the Bandit, it was like 1973, I think. The story, for anyone who's not familiar, Smokey and the Bandit is like Burt Reynolds has to drive a truck of Coors across the South, to get this special product to whatever, some wedding. I can't remember the premise. But I mean, President Gerald Ford was flying into Denver, stocking his Air Force One with Coors and flying it back to the White House. That is the mystique of Coors. And so I think part of it is marketing, and part of it is this commitment to quality that really did make it taste different than Schlitz and Bud and all of these big mega brewers at the time. Yeah, the Rocky Mountain Spring Water, that's their thing, right? Critically, the waterfall on Coors, it's not Fish Creek. I'm sorry to tell this group of Steamboat, it's not Fish Creek Falls. I asked the head archivist at Coors, it's just a generic waterfall. Sorry. Yeah.
So, how's Steamboat doing in the beer world?
I mean, you tell me, this is pretty good. Yeah. Storm Peak, really good. You know what I think is really interesting is that breweries like Storm Peak, Westbound and Down, Outer Range in Frisco, they're the ones that are doing great. Mostly because they're in kind of tourist places, and Colorado is known as a place to get a craft beer, so it's part of your Colorado tourist experience. But this is like the whole last chapter of the book, so I'm not going to give it away. You can tell where the New West has infiltrated, essentially, right? This is the outdoor recreation, the amenity economy that replaced the extraction economy in Colorado. Beer is such an integral part of that now that it's known worldwide. And so when you come to Colorado, going to a brewery, whether it's in Denver or Frisco or wherever you're recreating or wherever you're traveling to, that's a quintessential Colorado experience. And you know, I think it used to be true that the farther you get outside of Denver, the less interesting and the less quality the beer had. It's just not true anymore. I mean, I put Storm Peak up against any brewery in Colorado. You know, and it's, you know, I think part of that is just there's expertise, and part of that is who wouldn't want to live up here and brew beer? I mean, it's just